Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight I want to talk about threatened and endangered languages and the extinction of languages. In a way, since this is an issue for all Oklahoma Indian languages, in a way the Wordpath show is always about this. We're always discussing this topic with respect to one language or another, it seems like. But tonight I want to talk about some issues and concepts in a more general way that are related to endangerment and extinction, and that I think can shed some new light on language preservation issues. I'm going to compare the situation of biological species which are endangered to that of languages which are endangered. What does it mean to save something from extinction? Here's a cute picture of an endangered species of animal, the prairie dog. No one would say, gee, it's a good thing we have this picture so the prairie dogs are saved. We all know it takes work to save a species. We've all heard about the need to protect an animal's habitat, to protect it from overhunting, poisoning, roadkill loss, to protect the species that it feeds on, and so forth. If these steps are not taken, no amount of cute photographs are going to save the species. Clearly, I think that's clear to everyone. And yet, you would be amazed how many people, when they hear me say that I work in the area of language preservation, they immediately say, oh, you must go around tape recording and writing down languages before it's too late. That's what they think language preservation is. But I'd like to say that going around and writing down languages and even tape recording them and videotaping them is something akin to taking those photographs. It's almost like taking a snapshot of some portion of a language, but you don't get the whole picture. So I'd like to emphasize that that's not how you preserve a language, any more than photographing prairie dogs is how you would save them. If the prairie dogs die out, the photos like the one we saw a moment ago become simply photos of an extinct animal. Likewise, if Delaware or Cherokee or Ponca dies out, then a dictionary or a tape recording, no matter how excellent, of one of these languages will simply be, in a way, snapshots of a dead language. Just like so many dictionaries and grammars of Latin that we have today. Latin is nevertheless quite dead. So all the dictionaries, tapes, and textbooks will not by themselves prevent a language from becoming extinct. It's important to have such things as reference works and also as documents of a performance or speech pattern or story or song of a particular individual. We'd like to be able to enjoy these things after the person is gone. But they won't save the language itself as a living language. For a language to really live, it needs to be passed on by living speakers using it in its natural context with other living speakers. Like culture in general, it lives and it breathes, and like any living thing, it needs to have its life needs met. So, my first point is, a language is a living, breathing thing, and I think that we should think of it that way. It's a whole way of looking at the world, of integrating speech and life, interacting socially, creating stories, oratory, songs, and other art in response to life. So to truly save a language as a living, breathing thing, we need to teach the language in as natural a context as possible and to teach it to the young, not just to adults. That's why I encourage people to use language immersion or master apprentice programs which are heavy on using language in a natural context and combining language with culture and with life. Now, my basic agenda tonight then is to compare biological species endangerment to language endangerment in a point-by-point way. I have 10 points to make. Number one, and I really just made this point, language is alive. Just as plants and animals have become extinct, many languages have already died. And once a language is gone, like an animal, it cannot be brought back to life. Extinction is forever. At the Intertribal Wordpath Society, we estimate that about 1/3 of Oklahoma languages are already gone, if not gone from the face of the earth, at least gone from this state. And by Oklahoma languages, I mean any languages that were once spoken in Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory, or the state of Oklahoma. And these include languages like Alabama, Cayuga, Hitchiti, Miccosukee, Kitsai, Coasati, Miami, Modoc, which is at least gone from Oklahoma, Natchez, although there's rumor there may be one speaker remaining in the state, Peoria, Quapaw, Seneca, which still has speakers in New York, Tonkawa, and Wyandot, which has speakers of the same or a very closely related language in Canada. But all of these languages have already disappeared from the state of Oklahoma. We have about 24 left, so about 1/3 are already gone. Second point has to do with the scale of endangerment. There's a difference of scale between biology versus languages. People rightly become very upset at the rate of loss of plants and animals. This is a hot topic these days. Most people, though, don't seem to realize that the threat to languages is even greater, much greater. The most endangered category in biology is mammals, with about 326 out of 4,400 species being either endangered or threatened, which is a lesser category. That comes to about 7%, I believe. On the other hand, 100% of Oklahoma Indian languages are threatened or endangered. 100%. Point 3. While certain plant or animal species may die out in an area, what often happens is that other new ones come in and fill that niche and take their place in the ecology of that area. For instance, Oklahoma gained a new species when armadillos migrated into the state, I think from Texas. I've heard this was in about the 1950s, a pretty recent addition of a species in the biology of Oklahoma. But it's different with Indian languages. No new Indian languages will be setting up headquarters in Oklahoma. What we have is all we've got. Other Indian languages spoken in other states are similarly threatened, and they're not going to be moving here, and the languages here are not going to be moving there. So it's much more finite, determined situation. No more new languages will be coming. Any niche that is vacated by the death of an Indian language will most likely be filled by English. Or another possibility is that the niche itself, say the religious or cultural ceremony that's related to that language, may itself disappear as well, and nothing will fill the place of the Indian language. Point 4. This has to do with habitat. Plants and animals need food and water to survive. That's why habitat is so important to them, and the size of the habitat that they can maintain. There must be enough space to produce enough food for an animal to hunt or harvest. Otherwise, it will starve or become so weak that it cannot reproduce. A language's food and water is that it needs to be used, and it needs to be used frequently enough and by enough people that people will find it important to maintain it, and that they'll be able to maintain their fluency and not get rusty in the language, not continually be getting out of practice. Habitat is also related to the areas of life where people still speak a language. If certain areas are entirely taken over by English, say the education of the young, which is the case in our state, then that part of the language, if there was special vocabulary or usage related to that area, that part of the language will die. So it's important to keep a language active in as many realms of life as possible, I think. Sometimes speakers actually voluntarily cut back on their language's habitat, so to speak, by refusing to invent new names for new objects, new technological things, for instance. They say, no, our language is traditional, we don't need a name for a typewriter or a movie or a computer. But when they do that, they're yielding that entire part of the habitat of their children's world to another language, and thereby making their own language just that much less likely to be useful to people and to be used enough that it will survive. Point 5. Plants and animals live in ecological communities. We've all heard about ecology in the last couple of decades, where one species can affect the survival of another. So sometimes it's hard to convince people that the survival of, say, a particular little minnow is important to the world until you explain what other things might depend on that minnow in the food chain or in the entire community of species there. So maybe a larger fish feeds on that minnow, and there's a bird that depends on that fish for its food, and maybe there's some mammal that eats the eggs of that bird. And pretty soon, once you understand this concept of linked extinctions, it's clear that moving even one small thing from an ecosystem can have a very far-ranging and devastating effect. So what is the parallel in language? I think the concept of linked extinctions in language is the art and culture which are dependent upon the languages for their life, or are very closely interrelated with the languages. So, if the Comanche language dies out, what will happen to the traditional coyote stories created and passed on in Comanche through all these generations up until now? What will happen to traditional prayers in Comanche? What language will be spoken in the peyote tent where some people are still speaking Comanche, and what effect will that have on that culture and that religion? If the Caddo language dies out, no one will understand the words to the turkey dance songs anymore, and these are very important to Caddo culture. No one will understand the Caddo hymns or the old stories. So, languages don't live in a vacuum either. If they go down, a lot of other things will go down with them. Just as people worry that the rainforests are being destroyed even before we have a chance to study them and find out whether they harbor, say, the cure for cancer, so in the same way, languages are dying out before most of us have had a chance to have any real exposure to them and to see what songs, stories, jokes, and wisdom have traditionally been transmitted in that language, and that should be saved for all of humanity. Point 6 has to do with procreation. All species must procreate in order to replicate themselves so that their line can survive. Languages replicate themselves by being passed on from parents to children. But there is an advantage here in language, because once the adults in a plant or animal line become too old, they can no longer reproduce. So you may have, in fact, sterile individuals surviving. As soon as an older animal like that, which is too old to bear young, as soon as you get to that situation, you know that the species is doomed. But a speaker of a dying language, if they're in decent health, actually has the ability to pass on the language to younger people at any age in the speaker's life, right up until their 80s or 90s. If they're healthy enough to teach, they still have that capacity to pass on the language. On the other hand, there's no such thing in language as a seed or something like a seed. If you think about a seed in nature, in biology, it's a kind of delayed offspring. You can have a seed which endures for a year. I think some of them actually can last for many years, even beyond the life of the parent which created that seed, and after the parent dies, then the seed can sprout new life. No such thing in language. Once those last surviving older speakers are gone, there will be no seeds left. There will be no way to sprout that new language. Point 7. In biology, there is such a thing as island biogeography. I was just reading about this recently. I'm not a biologist, but I've been learning all kinds of fascinating things about the field, and I hope I'm getting them right. Island biogeography is the study of how species can survive in a very small niche, protected from interference from outside forces or threats by either water that surrounds them on an island or sometimes on land because of other barriers that surround them in an island-like condition. Is there a parallel in language? I think there may be. Very conservative communities that isolate themselves from outside influences probably have a greater chance of maintaining their languages than do more assimilated communities. So if a community is very reluctant to share its language with the outside world or to let the outside world into its community, even though it may have a small number of individuals in that community, I think it has probably, all other things being equal, it has a much higher chance of survival as a culture and a language than the language of a community that is more assimilated and where everyone is very bilingual and there's a lot of passage between the tribal world and the majority culture world. Point 8. There's something that biologists call minimum critical size. Some biologists study the concept of minimum critical size. In other words, they want to know how small can a population of animals or plants be and still sustain itself. There is a lower limit, apparently, in most cases. And what that limit is varies for different species for many different reasons, which I certainly don't understand in any detail. But there is this notion of minimum critical size. Is there such a notion for languages? Can we say, there are so many languages that are extremely endangered, can we say at some point, oh, there's too few speakers left, there's no way that language can survive? Is there some point that we could define in that way? I'm not sure about this one. I think this is a very difficult question. Clearly there are cases in Oklahoma of communities that have only 1 or 2 speakers of the traditional language remaining. I'm thinking about cases like Delaware or Lenape, perhaps, or Wichita. I don't think we want to say that those languages are extinct, even though the remaining speakers are very few and very elderly. And as long as at least one speaker is fairly healthy, there is theoretically at least the possibility that they could pass on the language to a whole new generation of speakers. It may not be very likely, but it certainly is at least theoretically possible. But there are other issues with language. For one thing, no one single speaker ever really knows the whole of a language, or all of its songs and stories and related cultural areas. There may be some very important specific differences. For instance, in some languages there are important differences between men's and women's speech. So if only women speakers remain in that language, then how would you describe that situation? The language is not extinct if there are any speakers remaining, and yet in a sense part of it has already died out if only the women's variety of the language has survived. There's also this additional fact that complicates this notion of minimum critical size with language, and that is that much of the life of a language resides in the way conversations are conducted and life is lived in the language in a multi-speaker kind of way. How people greet each other, joke with each other, ask and answer questions, give and follow commands, report on events, and so forth. This is usually at least a two-party event, not just a monologue with one speaker. So there are all sorts of facets of a language that are related to situations where the language is being spoken by more than one speaker at a time. So for that reason alone, you might want to say that one speaker is too few to really have much hope of the language surviving. So maybe you need at least two speakers. I think, and perhaps more if there are male and female varieties or other important variants that you want to keep going. The truth is, it takes a community of speakers of different ages and circumstances, perhaps different genders, to really maintain a language. Now, each community, each tribal community, I guess, will have to figure out for themselves, based on what they know about their language and their culture, when this language knowledge is getting too close to what they might want to call a minimum critical stage for their language. I think that might vary from culture to culture. Okay, point 9. Are there moral questions involved in all of this? What I'm getting at is this notion: does every creature or every language have a right to exist? Is it an evil thing? Is it something wrong in the world when a species or a language dies out? I think this is a philosophical question that each person should think about, and there may be various reasons for having differing opinions on this. For myself, I tend to come down on the side of, the more diversity, the better, and I hate to see anything die out unless it's something harmful. I would point out that much of the damage done to Indian languages in Oklahoma and in the whole United States was done during times of great political repression and second-class citizenship for Indian people. And so I do happen to think, in the case of Indian languages, there's kind of a special case. I can't see how anyone would not believe that the United States does have some moral obligation to help try to save what is left of their languages and cultures before it's too late. Point 10 has to do with aesthetics. I do value biodiversity for the reasons that biologists say that, we may be killing off the cure for cancer. It's important to have a certain diversity to keep ecological communities healthy and so forth. But I also value biodiversity because I happen to believe that that's how the Earth should be. It just seems right to me. We wouldn't want to be down to just a few species. It would profoundly change the nature of what the Earth is, I think. I think the same applies to language. Despite what some folks might say, I really don't think that it would be good for all people to speak just one or a few languages. Linguists like to study different languages because of their own intellectual curiosity and wanting to add to the richness of the field of linguistics, and they have kind of scientific reasons. They don't want to say that make statements about the nature of language which wouldn't have been true if language X hadn't died out last year. They want to sort of get the complete picture so that they can better understand what language is and what the human brain is that has been able to come up with this great variation, this great rich variety and richness of different languages with their own different structures. So there's a kind of scientific reason on the side of language as well to think that linguodiversity, if we can call it that, has its own value to the scientific community. But I also, kind of the same with the animals, I also kind of like it that humans speak 6,000 languages and not 600 or 6. I just like that fact about how the Earth is. I like that rich diversity. I like that you can go to different countries and hear different languages and see different cultures. To me, that has some kind of humanitarian, humanities kind of value to it in and of itself. There are about 6,000 languages spoken in the world. And by the way, this language endangerment issue is not just an issue that applies to Oklahoma or just to Indian languages. It's been estimated recently that of these 6,000 languages, about 90% are in danger of dying out within the next 100 years, believe it or not. Imagine if we had a similar case for biological species, that 9/10 of the species on Earth were going to croak within the next century. People would be outraged. Somehow I think people don't get as upset about language, and it's partly because they're not aware of what's going on. It's partly because they don't maybe have the same, we're not raised anyway in this country with the same kind of appreciation for linguistic diversity that we are for animal diversity. Maybe it's partly that languages aren't cute and fuzzy like that little prairie dog. We don't kind of give them the human qualities. We don't sort of relate to that in that sort of anthropomorphic or humanistic kind of way. For whatever reasons, people don't seem to get as upset, but the number of biological species that are this threatened is way, way smaller, by orders of magnitude smaller. So the language situation is far more threatening. And I said I was going to talk about aesthetics. I got a little off on the statistics there. The aesthetic side of this, I think, let me quote from Lewis Thomas. I believe he's a biologist. He's author of the Medusa and the Snail. And he said of vanishing species, he said, don't forget their holistic beauty while doing science. Appreciate them, but don't reduce them to systems that kill their hairy complexity. I really like that phrase, hairy complexity. And let's hear it for hairy complexity in animals and in languages. Well, those are the 10 points that I had to make comparing biological species endangerment with language endangerment. And now I'd like to ask, what can we do with this? I suggested that this might give us some new ways of looking at things and that we might be able to benefit by looking at language as if it were an endangered species. So what can we do with all of this information and these ways of thinking of things? I have some suggestions of how to apply this approach. Number one, the point that language is a living thing. I just need to emphasize that language is not a list of words that can be simply summed up in a dictionary. Dictionaries are great, but there's a lot more to language than that. So what are the implications practically for this? If you are in a tribal community that's trying to preserve your language, or if you're involved in any way with preserving an Indian language, I would suggest that you keep this firmly in mind. If you're teaching language as if it were a static thing, or a dead thing, or a list of objects, then you're not getting it all, you're missing a lot. And this is why I suggest that people bring culture into the classroom and use mainly an oral approach. How many people have you known who went to an Indian language class where the class basically consisted of going through a list of 20 words each night, and then the next week going through another list, and the next week another list? At the end of that class, they had kind of learned about the language and some interesting things about it, and they probably had their curiosity satisfied in some ways, but they weren't fluent. And you can take a class like that over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how many times you take it. You will never become fluent because you aren't learning the language as a living language. You are learning it as if it were a set of static objects, which it isn't. So I'm very big on suggesting that people use a mainly oral approach to language teaching. There should be a lot of conversation in your classroom. From the very first class, people should be able to have some kind of exchange with each other, even if it's just something that means, hello, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? What's your name? My name is. You should be able to do that after one good intense lesson in any language and take it from there, and always as oral as possible and as rich and lifelike and natural as possible. You need to have the word list for reference, just as we need dictionaries and grammar books, and you need to have some lessons of that sort. But always be thinking oral, because you should be thinking language is a living, breathing thing. Now, we talked about habitat. We need to feed the languages, so to speak, by using them. So you need to use them in the classroom. You should be thinking in your Indian communities about fostering ways for the language to be used again in tribal meetings, putting signs on doors in your language rather than just in English, starting a meeting at least with a set phrase in your language. If people are not fluent enough to do a whole meeting in your language, you can gradually bring in more and more phrases that people will pick up and start using, that at least those phrases will start to have a life of their own. The more they're used, the more natural they will feel. Some people have told me they're only interested in saving their language or learning their languages so they can do a certain ceremony or so they can pray in the language or something like that. Be very conscious of what choices you're making in these areas, because if all you're interested in saving is a ceremony, that's more or less of a rote thing. In most cases, that's something that could be memorized, looked up in a book, tape recorded. If you need to decide if that's what you want your language for and that's enough, okay. You're only saving one small niche of its habitat. If that's what you want, okay. But if you want it to be a living language, and if you want people to be able to listen to those ceremonies and prayers and understand them, not because they memorize a particular ceremony or prayer, but because they speak the language, then you need to pay attention to a lot more than just those certain memorized things. You need to think about inventing new names for new technology. The future of any language is with the young. Young people are fascinated by technology. They're always into the latest computer game or television or whatever. They need to talk about it because they're fascinated by it. If they can only talk about it in English, as I said before, you've basically yielded a large part of the potential habitat of your language and life to another language, thus shrinking the habitat that's left for the language to fulfill. So think about these issues very seriously. Linked extinctions that we talked about. What else would die if your language dies? Think about this. Get together a language committee and make lists of things that you think people do in your language and that it's important to do in your language, and make sure that your language teaching and preservation is aimed in such a way that it helps to save these cultural things as well. Make sure you're not overlooking anything. Minimum critical size was an issue we talked about. Make sure that you survey your language and you know how many people speak it and how well they speak it, and that you monitor the situation and keep abreast of it and do everything you can to keep ahead of that endangerment curve. Procreation. Do everything you can to help the fluent elders that you still have to be in good reproductive health, language-wise. In other words, make sure that if they need a hearing aid, that they have it. If they need transportation to a class, that they have it. If they have pain, that it's attended to. If they have any other problem, you want to make everything as comfortable for them as possible so they can be as effective as possible as language teachers. And finally, of course, as I ended before on the list of comparisons, think about the moral and aesthetic questions. Just be very conscious of it. Get together and talk with your fellows about this. You know, would it be bad to lose our language? How bad would it be? Why would it be bad? What else would we be losing? And even you non-Indians who may just be listening to this show because you think it's a curiosity and, gee, I didn't know there was all these Indian languages out there. Do you feel that this is important enough as a feature of human diversity on this planet? Do you think it's important enough that you feel compelled to help? Can you contribute money? Can you provide a ride for someone, or contribute paper for the Xerox machine, or whatever might be necessary to a local language learning program in your area? Think about it very hard and do whatever you can. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaole kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaole kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaole kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaole kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaole kita.